All right, we're going to go ahead and get things started. So my name is Jackie Borchert. I am the CEO at Vision Forward Association and the co-chair of the Data and Research Committee that was part of Vision Serve Alliance's Aging and Vision Loss National Agenda. So as part of our committee work, we have developed a research article collection. And through that, we have also wanted to build the knowledge and skills and expertise of people in our field in this area. So we are incredibly excited to invite you all to this afternoon's presentation around becoming an educated reader of research. And it is my distinct pleasure to be able to introduce this afternoon's presenter, Dr. Robert Wall Emerson. So I'm going to read just a brief bio and talk a little bit about some of his expertise that helps to support his ability to share and present on this really important topic. So Dr. Robert Wall Emerson, Ph.D., is a professor in the Department of Blindness and Low Vision Studies at Western Michigan University. He is a certified orientation and mobility specialist and a teacher of children with visual impairments. He has conducted blindness-related research for over 25 years and has published over 85 peer-reviewed articles, 9 book chapters, and he is one of 3 editors for the 4th edition of the Foundations of Orientation and Mobility. He was the research editor of the Journal of Visual Impairments and Blindness from 2012 to 2024, where he has published 35 statistical sidebars, and he has recently taken over as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Visual Impairment and Blindness. So it is my pleasure to turn things over to Dr. Wall Emerson at this time.
Well, thank you very much. Before I get into it, let me just say that in my mind, really, this talk is a bit bifurcated. The original idea was, what is research? And it morphed into being an educated consumer of research, not knowing who is going to be in the audience and what your level of facility with research methods is. I wanted to make some comments that perhaps everyone could take something from, even if some of the things I'm going to talk about today are old hat to you. So that being said, let's spend a minute talking about the idea of what is research. Before we get into that even, let me make a few comments about the people who conduct research, human beings, about all of us. We all have certain tendencies, and we have certain tendencies that may go against what we think of as good research methods. Typically, good researchers are not born, they are made, because it is not our innate sense of how to operate in the world. And let me talk about that a little bit. A lot of humans have something called a tendency toward magical thinking. This is something that developed through evolutionary processes. It was something that developed in our neurology to try and explain what was happening in the world around us. If we are thinking hundreds of thousands of years ago on the African savanna, there's thunder, there's lightning, there are animals that prey upon us. We want to try and understand what these forces are. We want to be able to predict what's going to happen the next day, the next week, the next month, the next year. And so we ascribe causes and effects as best as we are able. And sometimes this leads to the fabrication of perhaps supreme beings to uh, throw lightning in the sky. Um, it often leads to certain commonalities in thinking, in that a very common way of magical thinking is the like begets like idea. That if you want it to rain, you need to conduct a ceremony where you sprinkle some sort of liquid. By that sort of ritualistic sprinkling, you will get a greater rainfall. If you defeat a brave warrior in battle, you admire that warrior, you want some of their strength and bravery, and so by eating their heart, you take on that person's characteristics. Um, all of this sounds obviously like we would have evolved way past this way of thinking, right? However, how many people do you know, perhaps you as well, uh, wear a certain jersey or a certain color when supporting your favorite football, basketball, baseball, rugby team? And I'm sure we know of people who get quite upset if they are not able to wear that jersey or that color for that game, the big game. Because if they don't, the team's going to lose. Now, at some level, we might understand that really whether we wear that shirt or not doesn't really influence the team's performance. And yet, there's a part of us that has this sort of magical thinking of we can influence events by that sort of ritualistic behavior. So, this is all to say that human beings have some quirks in how we view the world and how we interact with the world that doesn't always lead to us understanding objective truth and interacting with what objective truth might be. And that is what research is supposed to be. Research is an organized and unbiased search for objective truth. Now, what I'm saying is that we have to be very careful because of how we are built on how we get involved in this whole research game, because there are a lot of pitfalls in how we do that. Um, Humans are actually pretty bad at objective thinking. Um, and this is not, you know, to talk smack about humans in general. I'm a human. We're all humans here. But we're actually really bad at this. You know, we're getting better as we understand our neurology more. Um, the NPR show Hidden Brain is great in that it talks about, you know, all these little nuances of how we operate in the world, um, and how we can be misled because of how we operate. Um, each of us has a certain worldview. We don't often know the extent of that worldview. It's built from our formative years up to our early teen years, essentially. The way that we are raised, the things that we are exposed to, what we experience, how we feel about it, how others around us are feeling, and how their emotions are impinging on us. All this feeds into how we view the world around us. And around age 16, that gets locked in. That's about the age where you develop the sense of self that will then exist through the rest of your life. It can get tweaked in huge changes. There can be changes, but by and large, people have the same essential personality and the same essential worldview through their life that gets locked in about middle teen years. I'm focusing on this because the way that you as an individual view the world impacts um, the kinds of questions you ask, what you're interested in. And we're getting into the research game now. If research is supposed to be an endeavor to find the objective truth, if the person doing that already has innate biases that they may not even be aware of, that sort of poisons or skews, at least, the whole enterprise from the very beginning. And this is why good researchers and good consumers of research need to approach it with a sense of, if not skepticism, at least critical thinking. Be open to question anything. Um, History of research is littered with examples where people were looking for one thing, and by making a mistake or thinking they made a mistake or by doing something incorrectly, were led to a different discovery that opened up a whole new line of inquiry. Um, that doesn't happen if you're not open to questioning things. Why is this happening? Are these values not the way that I thought they were going to be? Um, Research should not be entirely an endeavor where you uh, prove what you already know. The best thing for a researcher is to find out things they never even thought of. The research that we're going to talk about um, is the process of systematizing critical thinking, organizing the asking of questions in order to arrive at objective truth, hopefully navigating around, bypassing, negating our own inherent biases and the influence of random error from the world around us. That's sort of the take-home point of all of this is um, research at its heart is an attempt to find truth regardless of the person doing the finding and all that they bring to the endeavor, and um, to the exclusion of unexplained random error in the environment. And so the core of the process is uh, collection of data. These can be measurements, observations, facts, whatever they are. It's a systematic process of collecting information. Now, a lot of people will say, yeah, I'm going to go research that, meaning I'm going to go to the internet and look up a bunch of information. It's a very off the cuff way of referring to research. That's not the kind of research we're talking about. It's the beginnings of it because it is a somewhat systematic look for related information. But true research is when we want to control things as much as able so that the influence of outside error is controlled. A point that we will come back to occasionally in this talk is that it's easier to see patterns in data, differences between groupings with more information. If you, let's say, want to know how well third graders are at reading, you can take two third graders and measure their reading. You'll get a measure, But I think we could all see that if you also take the reading measurement of 1,000 third graders, you'll have a more precise measure of reading for third graders overall. And then you can probably already figure out that this gets into all sorts of nuances into, okay, so what measure did you use? And did all these kids come from the same place, or are all these kids the same as each other, or are they diversified in some way? Did you measure them all on the same day, or that across years? Uh, there's a lot of different things that can have an impact on your measures. And when we get into the research method, the scientific method, really it, it can get very complicated, it can get very nuanced, but at its heart, all these complications and nuances, all these different designs of studies are ways to try and limit the um, unmeasured impact of all these outside variables. If you can measure the impact of the outside variables, then they're part of the study and that's fine. But if there are things that are impacting what you are researching and you're not taking account of them, then you're not really able to say much about what it is that you have. So let's take a look at some different types of studies. So all that was to say, to lay the groundwork of sort of what is research. Now, to be a good consumer of research, we have to keep all that stuff in the back of our minds. We have to approach things. If we're reading a research article, if we're getting involved in a research study, we have to approach things with an open mind, but a critical mind. Question everything, but be ready to accept that what you thought was true perhaps was not. All right. So there's many different types of studies. Um, if research is a collection of information or data, a study is a way to organize that collection. And as I said, even the questions that you ask could reflect that internal bias. In the latter part of the 19th century, early 20th century, there was a big movement on eugenics or racial differences because there was an assumption that because different races looked different, that they must inherently be different in all facilities. Uh, so there was a lot of research done to prove what people already knew, when in fact, just asking that question skewed results. If you're asking to prove that some idea is true, you're asking the wrong question. The question should be, is this the way it is? But people were already set with a conclusion. It's fine to have a hypothesis. You can have an idea of, I think this is the way the world is. But, prove me wrong. Data, prove me wrong. A lot of the eugenics movement, the race difference studies, did not have that open mind. They instead were seeking to prove a point and wanted to simply collect the data to prove the point. And that leads to throwing out data that don't agree with your preconceptions. And it can be a very slippery slope. You know, you just throwing out a couple of pieces of data might make things agree with how you think the world is. But by doing that, you've ruined the entire study. Um, One of the classic ways of categorizing the different ways of doing studies is into two camps, qualitative and quantitative. These are two very different ways of approaching the answering of questions. And certain questions are certainly answered better one way or the other. Qualitative is more inductive. It takes in everything that it can and uses all that it takes in to construct an understanding or a meaning, a gestalt, if you will. Um, so a great example is ethnography. There, a researcher, often an anthropologist, is embedded in a society and takes part fully in that society. They become a member of that society so that they get to experience, they get to try and understand every facet of that society and build an understanding from that. Um, Quantitative, which is what a lot of people tend to think of when they use the word research, that's more fixed and deductive. You know, it's much more. You can think of the clinician in the lab coat in a lab with the test tubes and beakers. That's quantitative, typically. Uh, they're measuring things. They're getting numbers. Now, qualitative gets numbers too, but quantitative focuses on getting those numbers and controlling variables. The idea of doing things in a laboratory is that you can control all the outside influences and just vary one or two things so that you know if group A and group B are different, it's because of the one thing you allowed to be different between group A and group B. Um, the classic sort of gold standard for quantitative studies is a randomized control group design. There's lots of different designs under qualitative and quantitative. But this is the classic quantitative design where as you bring participants into the study, you randomly assign them to an experimental group or a control group. By randomly assigning them, you essentially um, equalize the two groups, the experimental and the control group, on a host of factors because assuming you have enough participants in each group, a large number in each group, you get about equal numbers of men and women, of people who are Caucasian, people who are African American, people who are uh, Pacific Islander. There's just an equal distribution of all these different things, older people, younger people, whatever, in the two groups. And so you don't have to worry about those things so much influencing the study because they're controlled. And then, just like in a lab, when you're controlling things in a petri dish, you control the two groups for on whatever thing you might be studying. You introduce something to the experimental group. You do an intervention, you expose them to something, whatever it might be, and then you don't do that to the control group, but you give them something that seems about equal, but isn't going to have the same effect. Um, for example, I don't know, it could be something as simple as in drug trials. The experimental group gets the experimental drug, and the control group gets a sugar pill. So they still have the experience of taking a pill that looks like the other pills. Nobody knows which group they're in. And then you see whether there's a difference in whatever is being measured. Perhaps it's a disease, whatever it might be, in between the experimental and control groups. So that's sort of the classic, the randomized control group design. There's also things like surveys and focus groups, and those can really sort of be under either category, depending on how they're structured. When people are conducting research, well, let's just say we're going to go back to being a good or an educated consumer of research. When you're reading research studies, a lot of people will tend to read the abstract, uh, maybe the introduction, and then the conclusion. And they tend to really skip over the methods and the results because it's full of a lot of jargon and a lot of numbers. And they just want to get to the high points. I can understand that attitude, but I would contend that the methods and the results sections can hold very important information that explains and gives background and perhaps uh, might fully uh, complete the conclusions of the study. When you're looking at the abstract and the conclusions within a given manuscript, that may not in fact be the whole story. There may be portions of the methods or the results that are very important in understanding what was done and what was found. And so sometimes there's a barrier in this jargon. So let's just hit a couple of the jargony terms. We're talking here mainly about quantitative research, since again, that's what most people tend to think of when we say research. So most every study is going to have a bunch of variables, which is simply a thing that is being measured, an attribute or characteristic of a participant, of a measurement tool, um, of something that is measured within the study. Um, within this idea of variables, you will have independent and dependent variables. The independent variable is anything that the experimenter is able to change. So by giving a drug to the experimental group and a placebo or sugar pill to the control group, the pill, what each group got, that is the independent variable. That's what the researcher is controlling to see the effect of. The dependent variable is anything that changes as a result of what was done with the independent variable. And so, again, in this case of a drug or a sugar pill, the dependent variable is whether or not there is a difference in disease outcomes in the two groups. So it would be disease outcome. And you could have more than one of each. You can have a bunch of independent variables and dependent variables in a study. But that's the basic idea. Sample size. That's just how many participants or units of analysis are in the study. When I say units of analysis, not every study is made up of people. If you're thinking of, physics or chemistry, they're doing experiments on materials, material science, engineering. They're doing lots of studies. They're taking data, but not on people. And so the unit of analysis is the number of observations, the number of measurements that are done in a certain group or in a certain condition. As I said before, more is better, but only up to a point. Um, I won't. I don't want to get into any mathematics of analysis, but uh, there is something called a power analysis, uh, which is a mathematical calculation that tells you how many participants, how many units of analysis you would need in order to be pretty sure. And by say pretty sure, there's different levels of what that means. By pretty sure that any result that you find is going to be due to what you did, not due to something else happening in the system or in the world. Um, and so this idea of sample size is interrelated with effect size and with statistical significance, um, which I probably talk about on the next slide, but I'm going to talk about now since I'm on that topic. These three things all sort of are linked to each other. So let me tease that apart a little bit. When we talked about measuring the reading abilities of third graders, we recognize that measuring 2 of them is not as good as measuring 1,000 of them. You will get a more uh, precise measure, a measure that is not pulled too much, an average measure that's not pulled too much by extreme values, the more values you have. Um, if you measure just 2 kids and they happen to be 2 really great readers, you'll have a skewed view of what a third grade kid can do in terms of reading. If you randomly choose 1,000 third graders, it's less likely that they're all going to be really great readers. You're more likely to get a true average reading value for third graders for kids, from wherever you got those kids from. It may be all from the same state, or they may be from the same school division, or what have you. So that's an idea of how the sampling fits into it. As you move from 2 up to 1,000, which are arbitrary numbers here, your power increases. You are more likely to see an effect if you uh, have 1,000 kids in one reading program and 1,000 kids in a different reading program. You have a high power. You have a very good likelihood of being able to tell if those 2 reading programs show a differential effect in those 2 groups of third graders. It does depend on effect size. Effect size is a different measure of sort of the underlying size of the effect. It's right there in the name, effect size. Um, and so it's a way of sort of getting at how big the effect you are looking for is without knowing really, even if there is an effect. I know it doesn't sound like something that you can actually do. You can't really quantify something that you don't know, but it's a power and effect size are linked in that um, a certain sample size, a certain number of participants will give you a certain level of power, a certain ability level in order to get a true finding of effect sizes of different levels, if you follow me. So adding to your participants will increase your ability to find smaller and smaller effect sizes. Now, that sounds good, but up to a point, because there is a difference between statistical significance and clinical meaningfulness. Just because there is a statistically significant difference between group A and group B does not mean that it's really that important. And so a researcher has to walk a fine line in determining how many participants do they need to be pretty sure that they're going to find an effect, if there's an effect there to find, but not so many participants that they'll find an effect no matter what. Um, so let's bring this into the world of blindness and orientation mobility. Let's say we're looking at the length of a cane and its ability to detect drop-offs. And the question is, oh, well, is a longer cane better at detecting drop-offs? And I won't go into other factors, that, angle of holding the cane and how fast you move it and all that kind of stuff. But just look at cane length. Uh, and we look at, two lengths of cane. We take a bunch of measures or trials or repeated measuring over and over again as someone walks towards drop-offs of different sizes. And we find that there's a statistically significant difference between two canes that are different by 10 inches in their length. That's one thing. Statistically significant means there is a difference. As far as we are able to tell, there is a difference in the longer and shorter cane in detecting the drop-off. Okay, great. But how big is that difference? If the difference is 0.1 of an inch, if the longer cane can detect 0.1 of an inch difference, well, let's phrase it this way: 0.1 of an inch less of a drop off than the shorter cane. And that's a significant difference. Statistically, I would argue that it doesn't really matter. Just because adding 10 inches can detect 0.1 drop-offs that are 0.1 inch shallower doesn't really buy you a whole lot. So there's not a lot of clinical meaningfulness in that. And these are the kinds of nuances that would be found in reading the methods and the results sections. If you read just the discussion section or just the abstract of an article talking about the cane length and detecting drop-offs and how big were the drop-offs, and they said, yeah, that longer cane was better at detecting drop-offs than the shorter cane, that would be one thing, but it's erroneous. It's misleading to just say that, when in fact, the difference in the amount of drop-offs that they can reliably detect is so small that it's essentially meaningless. This is what would happen the more subjects you have in a study. Again, depending on how exactly the study is organized and how it's analyzed. But there is, a point where adding more participants, adding more measures, adding more trials may start to find differences where really the meaningful differences don't exist. And so you have to know when to stop. Most researchers stop well before that because they can't afford the number of participants that it would require to get to that point. Now, a couple of other terms that um, pop up a lot are validity and reliability. And I love this graphic. I got this graphic from Cohen's kappa, Understanding Cohen's kappa coefficient by Curtis Pikes, but it's been reproduced in different ways all over the place. It's a great way to conceptualize validity and reliability. Validity is a measure of how well something measures what it's supposed to measure. If you're measuring depression in a patient, does your series of questions actually measure depression, or is it measuring something else? Reliability is consistency with how an instrument or a person measures something. And so if you are both reliable and valid in this instrument or in this process, you'll be in that graphic to the right. This is a dartboard. All the darts would land close to the center, which is like the true value that you don't know because we don't know objective reality, right? We don't know what that is. But if we've determined that we have a measure that is both reliable and valid, we can be pretty confident that most of our measures are going to be close to that true value and not very much around it. So you get a tight cluster around the true value. The second from the left graphic, where there's just a cloud over the whole dartboard, it's valid because the average value of all those darts is that true value in the center. So on average, it gives you a true value, but it's not reliable because it's just all over the place. So the second from the right, when it's not reliable or valid, it's all over the place, and the average doesn't even get at the true value. It's just not useful at all. And then the one on the left shows reliable. You keep getting a very similar result whenever you use the measure or the instrument or whatever it is, but it's nowhere near the true value. And that's a difficult situation because we don't know what the true value is. So we don't always know that our instrument that keeps getting the same result, so we're happy about that because it's reliable, we may not be aware that it's way off base in terms of what we're trying to get at is, which is the validity. And all of these terms have hours and hours that you could delve into more deeply. Assumptions. When we're talking about statistical tests that people run on studies, there are typically a set of assumptions that tests will have, and researchers don't always talk about them. They should always test for them to make sure they're using appropriate statistical tests, but they don't always report them in manuscripts because they don't have enough space, really. It's great when they do, so you know that they've looked at them. The most common is for parametric tests. Parametric tests are it's a class of statistical test where the assumption is that the data are normally distributed. And so you take a bunch of measures on some variable, and most of those scores, most of those measures are going to be close to the average measure. Some will be off to the higher side, some will be off to the lower side, but they'll form that bell curve in their distribution, with most in the average and then decreasing amounts as you go further up or down from that average. So if the data conform to that distribution, it's a normal distribution, and that is an assumption for a set of tests. And I've already talked about that statistically significant versus clinical significance. Some common statistical tests, and I realize I'm getting close to the end of my time already, so let me just talk briefly about common statistical tests. A chi-square is non-parametric. So when your data do not conform to this normal distribution, there's another whole class of tests that you can use, and chi-square is a common example of that, where you compare two groups, not the average, because that would be used in a parametric test, but rather the median of the two groups often is used. A t-test is sort of the companion to a chi-square, but for parametric testing. So that in the t-test, you would compare the median, or sorry, the mean, the average of two groups of data. Analysis of variance is when you have, say, three groups or more that you are all comparing all across them. You could think of it like you've got 5 different schools and you want to compare math performance across these 5 schools. You get an average score for each of the schools, across all the students, and you can compare them using the ANOVA test. And then a step up from that is regression. Regression is where you have, again, let's say math performance for elementary school students, but instead of just looking at average performance and comparing that, you're looking at what might influence that performance, and you're seeing whether age and the school they go to and gender and who their teacher is. You see whether all these different variables, these independent variables, influence math performance, the dependent variable, and you get a model output from the regression saying how much each of those predictor variables influences the outcome. And then that leads to hierarchical linear modeling, where essentially you've got levels of regression models. A classic example of that is, again, looking at educational systems where you may have a regression model for math performance for students in a given classroom. And you've got this regression model where predictor variables might be age and socioeconomic status and gender and all these things that predict math performance. And then you've got this nested structure of classroom within a school division, or within a state. And it allows you to look at regression models in a more hierarchical way. So it's a different way of looking at that. Understand it. It's a very superficial treatment for these kinds of things. So as a educated consumer of research, again, you are reading articles, research articles with an open mind, with a critical mind. You're asking, did they do what they should have done? Could they have done something differently that would be better? Did they answer the questions they asked? Should they have asked different questions? And so the method section should always be reported so that the reader could replicate the study if they wanted to. So the question here is, did they tell you everything they needed to tell you? Or did they leave something out? How did they get their participants? What was the breakdown of participants along key characteristics? What was the equipment they used? What were their procedures? What were their measures? You need to be able to redo the study well enough that you could get the same results to prove that their results were veridical. And the results section should focus on just the facts. They give the numbers. They should have a table of participant demographics, especially in our field in vision. It's often important to have a table of visual characteristics of the participants because our participants are always so different visually that might influence the outcomes of the study, and we need to sort of be aware of the possibility of that. And they should often start with a table of means and standard deviations, sort of a bird's eye view look of the data, so that you could sort of see general patterns just in those data before you get into the nuances of statistical analysis. And when they get into that, they should tell you what the independent and dependent measures are for the analysis, what the results are with the significance levels, and what the effect size is. This is still something that is often not reported in research articles. And I've already talked about research to practice, the fact that statistically significant does not mean clinically relevant, and that increasing the sample size mathematically increases the likelihood of finding a significant result. And so um, more is not always better. There's a point where there's a trade-off. In terms of blindness specific research methods, I would direct you to these resources. Seemingly, they're all by this Wall Emerson guy. Strange. But there is an article, or sorry, a chapter in the Foundations of Orientation Mobility on research and the mobility specialist. That was in the third edition. It'll be in the fourth edition that is coming out imminently. But Tessa McCarthy and I wrote a chapter in 2017 on reading and interpreting research, much more what we're talking about in this presentation. But if you want to get just a little snippet of some statistical tests, I've been writing a statistical sidebar in the Journal of Visual Impairment and Blindness since 2015. And this is just a list of a bunch of the different kinds of topics. The idea is I take an article in a given issue that has some interesting statistical test or approach, and I write a sidebar explaining what it is they're doing or why they did it that way or what the math is behind that test. So it just sort of pulls the curtain back a little bit on that given test. And here you can see I've talked about the chi-square and logistic regression and MANOVA and power and Z-scores and all sorts of things. So those are in just generally each issue of the JVIB, which should continue for the foreseeable future. And with that, I thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so very much, Dr. Wall Emerson. This was a ton of great information, and hopefully it made everyone feel more empowered in being able to dig into some research and to understand the important information that's conveyed. I know we're really dedicated to try to use evidence-based practice in the work that we do, and certainly being a good consumer of research helps in that regards. If you're interested in this and would like to continue to be a part of research and helping to connect other professionals in our field with quality research, there is a great opportunity for you to be part of that. As I mentioned at the outset, I have worked with Dr. John Cruz as part of a co-chair of the Data and Research Committee. And one of the projects that has come out of that is our research article collection, which we had a webinar on in the past around how to utilize that database. And part of what we need to do is to make sure that we're continuously adding new articles to that database. And we need people that are willing to help to review articles and help us to identify critical pieces of research that can help our field to continue to learn and grow. So I am strongly encouraging all of you to consider joining our committee. We are looking going forward to only meet about 4 times or so a year. And this would be a great opportunity for you to be part of this work. But our next research article committee meeting is on Tuesday, October 1st at 3 o'clock Central Standard Time. And if you would be interested in joining our group, please shoot me an email. My email is jborchert@vision-forward.org. So please reach out to me and I would be happy to get you connected to our group. We have a lot of fun and are really committed to continuing to share research. So please reach out to me if you would be willing to be a part of that. So thank you again to VSA and thank you to Dr. Wall Emerson for today's presentation and appreciate all of you and your commitment to research.